In this lesson, we're going to take a look at creating a drawing of a cupcake with Prismacolor Premiere colored pencils on white Stonehenge paper. Hello there everyone, Matt here with thevirtualinstructor.com, and in this lesson we're going to take a look at creating a drawing of a cupcake using Prismacolor Premiere colored pencils on white Stonehenge paper. Now this particular lesson is featured in this month's issue. This is June of 2019 of Colored Pencil magazine. If you've never checked out this magazine, I suggest you do so, especially if you're interested in working with colored pencils. Now if you're brand new to this channel, I suggest that you subscribe to the channel. We cover a wide spectrum of drawing and painting media as well as subject matter. So if you've never subscribed, if you haven't subscribed yet, I suggest that you do so. Now with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into this lesson. So as I mentioned before, we're going to be working with Stonehenge paper, which is 100% cotton. It's a wonderful surface for working with colored pencils, and we'll be using Prismacolor Premiere colored pencils to complete this drawing. Now in this case, I've started with a Graphite Transfer. So basically we've just covered graphite on the back of the photo reference, placed some pressure over the top of the photo reference, tracing the contour lines, essentially transferring our drawing onto our drawing surface. Now we're going to start here with a bit of crimson red, and we're going to cover most of the entire of the body of the cherry with this application. You can see in these early stages we can still see a lot of the texture or tooth of the paper, which will slowly be eradicated with subsequent applications. We've also allowed some open areas for the highlights. You don't want to place any colored pencil applications in those highlighted areas since we want to make sure they're nice, bright, and white. Now it's time to start darkening up some of the values. We'll start with some of the shadowed areas, and we'll apply a bit of Tuscan red here with a little bit of a heavier pressure. You can see with this second application of color, we're starting to get rid of some of the tooth or the texture of the paper already. Here again, we're going to avoid applying the colored pencil applications in the areas of the highlights. Again, we want to preserve these areas. We'll apply a bit of white in just a moment. Now you'll notice as we continue to layer colored pencil applications over the top of what we've already got in place, our color is going to progressively have a little bit more depth. One of the mistakes a lot of beginning colored pencil artists make is they assume that you just need one specific color for an area, and sometimes that will work and they search for the perfect pencil. But a better approach is to layer your colored pencil applications. This creates a greater sense of depth in the color and makes a more representational drawing. Now before we go any further, we'll go ahead and preserve the highlights with a sharpened white colored pencil, and we're applying heavy pressure here over the highlighted areas that we've set aside. We'll also use the white colored pencil to go over the top of some of the areas where we've already applied a bit of red, and of course some mixing will happen, and that will create a lighter red or a pink in these areas. In this case, these highlighted areas are basically reflected highlights. So light is bouncing off of the icing of the cupcake and bouncing back onto the cherry. And this is why we're seeing highlighted areas in areas where you might expect to see shadow. Now we're going to use a little bit of dark umber here and start to make the values a little bit darker. Now this dark umber is essentially a dark brown, and we're going to avoid using black at all. So we're using a brown here because it is a warmer color that's also darker, and since red is a warm color, we can make the values a little bit darker by using this dark brown instead of using a black. Black tends to make a drawing look flat and sometimes unnatural, especially when we're working with colored pencils. Now we're going to go back in with a bit of Crimson Lake. Now this is a medium red. It's not quite as strong as Crimson Red. It's slightly darker. And we're going to go ahead and start filling in some of the tooth of the paper a little bit more and add an additional application of red. Again, working around the highlights carefully. Now you can still see quite a bit of the tooth of the paper at this point. We want our cherry to have a smooth surface texture. So to help us with this, we're going to use a colorless blender. Now a colorless blender is essentially a colored pencil that's just void of any pigment, so it's just the waxy binder. And you can see as we're using it and applying heavy pressure, the colors start to blend together and we start to eradicate more of the tooth of the paper. We'll still see some tiny specks of white here and there, but that shouldn't be a big issue. Now we're going to go back again with Crimson Red, and this is going to add quite a pop of color. It's going to make our red a little bit more intense and bring us to a more natural looking appearance with our cherry. Now, in this particular drawing, we're working from the top of the picture plane down to the bottom of the picture plane. And we're just taking each section of the cupcake, one section at a time, essentially. So now that we've finished with the cherry, we're going to move on to the body of the icing. And we'll start here with an application of pink. Now, once we've got the entire body of icing covered with our initial application of pink, we'll go back and start applying a little bit more pressure in the areas where we see darker value. Value is the darkness or lightness of a color. It informs us about the form of the object, the texture, and of course the light source. So we're going to place heavier pressure in the areas where we see shadow. So we're starting to better understand the form of the icing at this point just with one color. Now, this one color helps us understand where our folds are going to be located and where we have darker areas of value, but it is really not going to communicate the icing of the cupcake in a way that's interesting. So we need to add some additional colors here. So we're going to start here with a bit of lilac, which is essentially a light purple, and we're going to add it into some of the areas of midtone and in some of the areas of shadow. We're also going to pull in a little bit of an orange color. Here we're applying a bit of peach to some of the areas of midtone as well. So we've got a pink, a purple, and a very light orange here. And as we continue to make these applications, you can see that these applications are still relatively medium to light applications. So we're still seeing a lot of the tooth or texture of the paper. So essentially what we're doing here is by layering these colors, we're creating our own colors that are more interesting than the colors that you just find straight out of the pencil. And this is an approach that I would suggest that you take with your own colored pencil drawings. It creates additional interest, additional depth in the color, and of course it often leads to a more representational appearance to your drawing. Now we're going to go back in here with a bit of white and we're going to preserve some of the highlights. And you can see I'm using a circular motion as I'm using this pencil, and I'm applying moderate to heavy pressure here as well. And as we're making this application, we're starting to see again some of that tooth slowly be eradicated by these applications. Now we're going to go ahead and establish some of the very dark values that we see. We're going to do this with 90% cool gray. Now initially this color is going to stand out and seem maybe a little bit overly dark than it needs to be, but that's okay because we're going to go back in a minute with another color and make this shadow or these shadows feel a little bit more natural. Now, of course, Prismacolor makes a variety of different grays. You're welcome to use any gray that you wish. I chose a cooler gray here so it would contrast the warm shadow that we have on the cherry. We'll continue with light to moderate pressure, filling in all the areas of shadow that we see in all of the folds on the icing. Now we're going to go back and make the shadow appear a little bit more natural with a bit of Tuscan red. And of course, Tuscan red we used in areas on the cherry early on. So this is going to help tie the cherry with the body of the frosting here on the cupcake. And you can see when we make these applications, the shadowed areas start to appear a little bit more natural just because we're adding a bit of color to them. The 90% cool gray is, even though it's a cooler gray, it's still rather neutral. So adding a bit of color here helps quite a bit. We're still not applying very heavy pressure here with the Tuscan red. It's still a moderate application, so we're still going to see some of the tooth of the paper. Now, just as we did with the cherry, we're going to go back with the original color that we started with, and this is pink, and we're going to help to unify some of the applications. So now at this point, we're going to start applying a little bit more pressure to the pencil and pull this application over the top of both the shadowed areas and some of the highlighted areas, as well as the midtones, of course. This is going to bring back our original pink color here, but our shadows are going to appear quite a bit softer and our highlights are going to make more sense, and there's going to be a little bit of a clearer transition or a smoother transition between the highlights and the shadows. Now we're going to bring in another color, and in this case it's blush pink. This blush pink is a little bit more orange, so it's going to help to pull out some of those peach colors that we applied earlier. Now we're going to apply this color in the areas of middle value and bring it all the way up to the edges of the stronger highlights. even with moderate to heavy pressure placed on the blush pink, we still have too much of the tooth of the paper showing through, so it's back to the colorless blender to do some burnishing here. Now we're going to apply moderate to heavy pressure here with the colorless blender. We'll use circular strokes where we want to create smooth transitions between the different values, and we'll use more directional strokes where we want to communicate the form of each one of these folds a little bit more. Now we need to add a little bit of texture here and there, so we'll return back with Tuscan Red. In this case, the pencil is nice and sharp, and we'll apply heavy pressure to add some little dimples and impressions here and there. We can also strengthen up the shadows in areas and bring a little bit more of that red undertone to the shadows. As we continue to work down the picture plane, we'll next address the cake section underneath the frosting. Now, the pinks here are a little bit different, so we're going to start with an application of magenta. Now, this is, again, a light application, as you can see how much of the tooth of the paper is showing through. Now we're going to go back with a bit of peach and apply a little bit of a heavier pressure here with this application. Of course, the cake itself is, it's not a yellow cake. It does have a pinkish tint associated with it, but it is still a cake, so that peach brings back some warmth. Now we'll also pull down a bit of pink, the same pink that we used on the body of the frosting, but you can see here the pinks that we created in the cake section are definitely different from the pinks that we see on the frosting. We'll add a bit of cream here and there, again, to bring back some of that warmth in this area, and again using a heavy pressure in this section to help to burnish these applications. We need a little bit more of that natural cake color, so a bit of goldenrod is added, and then over the top we'll go back with our 90% warm gray here and start creating some of the shadowed areas. Now we used 90% cool gray on the frosting, now we're using 90% warm gray down here. Again, that's just to create additional contrast between the shadows. This color is great for creating little textures in the cake as well. And here again, you can see the shadows that we're creating with this pencil are really, really strong at this point. But just like we did with the frosting, we'll go back over our applications with our original color, in this case magenta, and make those shadows feel a little bit more natural. Now in the sections of the drawing where we saw the cherry, or where we have the cherry and the frosting, we used a colorless blender to burnish these applications. In this section, we're not going to need to do that because we're allowing the tooth of the paper to add the illusion of additional texture, of course, which closely mimics the texture that we would see in the cake section anyway. Now we're ready to move on to the wrapper underneath, and we'll start with an application of 20% French gray. Yes, yet another gray here. And this French gray is a very, very warm gray, so it'll contrast the other grays that we've used, especially the 90% cool gray. Now, over the top of this application, it's time for yet another gray. We're using quite a number of grays here. This time it's 30% warm gray, and this just adds a little bit more depth to the colors that we've added down here. And of course, it's helping to strengthen up some of the shadows. Now, of course, some of the color from the cake is showing through the wrapper. The wrapper is translucent and waxy, and we want to create this illusion in our drawing. So we'll go with a bit of magenta here right over the top of our gray applications, where we're seeing portions of that cake show through the translucent wrapper. Now, of course, the surface texture of our wrapper is smooth, so we're going to go ahead and use a colorless blender here and start working some of the colored pencil material into the tooth or texture of the paper. This will lead to a smoother appearance. It'll be a more natural appearance. It'll look like the surface texture of the wrapper. Now, as we're applying this colorless blender, you can see some of the colors become a little bit more intense. As we can see down here with the magenta, it's starting to really pop and stand out, which is what we want. We're using mostly directional strokes here to apply the colorless blender, and these directional strokes mimic the contours of the form of the wrapper itself. So these are mostly vertical strokes here. Of course, we're leaving those open areas of highlight around the edges of the wrapper as well. Now we're going to add a little bit of warmth down here. We can still see some of that cake color showing through, so a bit of goldenrod is added. You'll also notice that I've highlighted the contours of the upper portion of the wrapper with a bit of 90% warm gray. Now we're going to add some warmth and some browns to the bottom portion of the wrapper, and of course the values here are going to be much darker. So we're going to start with an application of burnt ochre, and this burnt ochre is a brownish orange, and it provides a nice base application for our darker browns that we're going to find down here. We're also going to pull some of this burnt ochre up into the wrapper a little bit further, about midway up. Now we'll start making some of the values down here, and of course make the shadows a little bit darker. And since the color temperature of most of the applications down here is relatively warm, that's why we're going to go with the dark umber to do this. So here we're applying medium to moderate pressure, or just simply moderate pressure on the pencil here. Since we've got a nice waxy base in place, we don't have to apply too much pressure with this dark umber to create the darker values that we need here. We'll continue working over to the right side of the wrapper, again strengthening the shadows with the dark umber. And then again with the colorless blender, we'll smooth the applications, burnishing the colored pencil applications into the tooth of the paper, creating a nice, even, smooth surface texture. Now, of course, our cupcake is floating in air at this point. We need to add a bit of shadow. So we're going to start with a bit of 30% warm gray and just define the shapes of shadow underneath the cupcake. In this particular case, we're working with multiple light sources. And because we have multiple light sources, we're going to have multiple locations of cast shadow here. Now, when you have multiple light sources and you have multiple cast shadows, you'll notice in areas where they overlap, the value is a little bit darker. So we're going to apply a little bit of a heavier pressure in the areas where they do overlap. We can see this just underneath the cupcake on the right and slightly on the left side as well. We'll add a little bit of variety down here with an application of 30% cool gray, primarily in the areas where the shadow is the strongest, where we have those overlapping shadows that are happening underneath the cupcake. Now we'll begin strengthening up the shadow down here, and we'll begin with 90% cool gray. We'll go right along the edge where the cupcake meets the surface of the table and create a nice strong edge here, a strong line with the 90% cool gray with heavy pressure. We'll also pull some of this color out into the areas where the shadow is the strongest using a very light pressure with the pencil. We're using mostly circular strokes here for this application, allowing a lot of the tooth of the paper to show through. Now we want to eradicate some of the texture of the paper that's showing through. So we're going to use a colorless blender now and work some of these applications into the tooth of the paper. We're using very heavy pressure here and creating transitions between the lighter sections and the darker sections with a bit of white. We'll continue applying heavy pressure with the white pencil, trying to eliminate as much of the tooth of the paper as possible. But in this case, some of the tooth of the paper is still going to show through, and that's just fine. We're still going to see little specks of the white of the paper showing through, but for the most part, we've covered this section with a heavy application of color, and we have nice transitions between our different values. And now our colored pencil drawing of a cupcake is complete. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you were able to pick up a couple of things here and there. Remember, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, I encourage you to do so. You can also check out 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free by clicking on the link on your screen or clicking on the link in the description below this video. We also have a membership program that includes video courses, weekly live lessons, ebooks, lesson plans for teachers, weekly critiques, and so much more. You can learn more about our membership program by clicking on the link in the description below. As always, I wish you the very best in your artistic success.